talk reasonably briefly to leave time for questions. And I want to basically just divide my remarks into a couple of pieces. One piece will be to talk about some of the key issues to understand about the Olmstead litigation that's happened, kind of drilling a little bit down on some of what Eve said in the litigation she described. And the second, as Jennifer suggested, to talk about some of the questions that are kind of approaching now, the newish questions, the questions that are increasingly occupying the time of folks who are working on community integration issues and will occupy more of everyone's time in the near future. I just would begin by saying, and I said something like this morning, Eve and I just came back from Japan, where we met with a bunch of government officials and academics dealing with disability issues, talking about how Japan deals with disability. And I find every time I go to another country and look at how they deal with disability issues, it gives me a very good perspective, because most of my life, I'm a civil rights lawyer. My job is to kind of hold the government accountable for the promises it makes to everyone, including people with disabilities. And, the government and private entities don't always keep those promises, and that's what keeps civil rights lawyers in business. And so you can develop an attitude of, my God, things are really terrible sometimes, and find a sense of at least difficulty, of a difficult journey of really working hard to overcome barriers that are put up by society to doing the right thing. And then I go to some other country and see what they're doing and think, wow, I'm really proud of our country, actually. We have a long way to go. We make a lot of promises we don't keep, but we make some really good promises and we keep an awful lot of them. And it's important to keep that in mind. I think of the ADA, this very fundamental bipartisan civil rights law, as the first panel said, as making a promise of people with disabilities being full and equal members of our community, of the community of the United States of America, and of Olmstead as an essential part of that promise. Really, the central part of that promise is why it's the Brown v. Board of the disability rights movement, as saying, look, everybody has the right, as Ira just enumerated in greater detail, everybody has the right, regardless of whether they have a disability, to live as a full member of the community, which means having an opportunity to participate productively in the community, to have a place to call your own, and to have control of your life on a daily basis. And when Beatrice talked about what it means to live in an institution, right, to have your life controlled on a minute-by-minute basis, not because of anything about you, but because you live in a place where there's so many people that it's got to be run according to the administrative needs of the folks who work there and are supposed to be providing services and supports, right? You see what this is all about. So to talk about the two areas I mentioned. First, the key takeaways, I think, from the Olmstead litigation that's happened, particularly in this era that I kind of mark as beginning with the 10th anniversary of Olmstead in 2009, when the Department of Justice first started to get very seriously involved in Olmstead litigation. There have been a number of settlements Eve talked about, and there's been more litigation, which nearly all of which I'm sure will result in settlements. But what can we learn from that litigation and those settlements? Well, one thing is the litigation and the settlements deal with every kind of disability you can imagine, right? So we're not just talking about people with psychiatric disabilities. We're not just talking about people with intellectual developmental disabilities. We're not just talking about people with physical disabilities. It's people with any of those disabilities, sometimes people with multiples of those disabilities. And we're not just talking about one kind of institution. So there's a paradigm that people have when they're thinking about this kind of litigation. It's building on the hill. It's the state psychiatric hospital, the state mental hospital. It's the big state, what used to be called a state school, later developmental center, developmental disability facility. It's sometimes those kinds of facilities. It's sometimes also facilities like nursing homes, which can be privately operated, like board and care homes, which are basically congregate facilities, privately operated, where people with disabilities go and are sent to live that don't really provide much in the way of any services at all. It's all of these, and people with every single kind of these disabilities in every single kind of these facilities. It's really a very pervasive problem in the disability world, this problem of unnecessary institutionalization. And I think it's been very important for people who've been enforcing Olmstead to expand their understanding of what institutionalization is, to see that it's not just when Lois Curtis gets sent to the Georgia State Hospital instead of getting services in her own home, but it's also these kids in Florida who should be getting services in their own home but can't get them because of the way Medicaid's set up unless they go into a nursing home in Florida, which is absolutely outrageous. It's also about how people spend their time, focusing on what the harm of institutionalization is. It's the harm of being denied the opportunity to make your own choices on a day-by-day, minute-by-minute basis about who you associate with, how you spend your time, when you eat, when you go to the bathroom, when you turn your light out at night, all of that. And when you think about those issues, the issues in that way, it leads to some important questions about other taken for granted aspects of the way we deal with disability, which I'm going to get to in a bit. So those are key takeaways. I think another key takeaway is that the Olmstead litigation that's happened has largely been resolved, nearly always been resolved, ultimately through settlement agreements, through negotiated settlements between individual plaintiffs, disability rights organizations, the Department of Justice on one side, and states on the other. And they've been ultimately amicably resolved cases. Now, these are not cases that have been kumbaya love fests from the beginning. It's not like anybody likes to hear, we're going to sue you. It's not like anybody likes to hear, any state likes to hear from the Department of Justice, we're investigating you. And many times, of course, the state pride of people who are being investigated gets activated and agitated by the announcement of a federal investigation, and sometimes those are issues to work through. But the cases have been resolved in a very amicable and win-win sort of manner, and ultimately resolved in states with Democratic governors and Republican governors. And we're not talking about, we're talking sometimes about very conservative Republican governors. Eve talked about the Georgia case, which I had the opportunity of working on and negotiating the agreement with, and I sat across from Sonny Perdue, the very conservative then Republican governor of Georgia, who was not happy when we began our aggressive investigation and litigation of the case, but who ultimately was convinced that the right thing to do was to reach a settlement that provided services for 10,000 people with disabilities in the community, in their own homes, not in psychiatric facilities. And we've seen this pattern with Democratic governors like Jack Markell in Delaware as well. We've seen the pattern across partisan and ideological lines for a few reasons. One is I think people really do want to do the right thing. I can be cynical sometimes in my work, and you get that way when you deal with problems day in and day out. But I also fundamentally think that you have folks who are elected to public office who want to do good. And Sonny Perdue was convinced that they weren't serving the people of Georgia who had disabilities, who had developmental disabilities, who had psychiatric disabilities well in the system they had, and wanted to do something about it. Also, I think there's an educational aspect to it, that people don't understand what their obligations are under the law, under Olmstead. And I think this is true because particularly the government was not a major player in the enforcement of Olmstead for the first 10 years. Played a role, but was not a major or central player. In the last several years, it has become a much bigger player, both in litigation, in issuing technical assistance documents from the Department of Justice, as well as from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as really important statements from the Centers on Medicare and Medicaid Services, which play a crucial role here. So this has become something people are being educated about. As they get educated, they want to comply with their legal obligations. People also across ideological lines, across partisan lines, want to comply with Olmstead, want to reach agreements here, because they find that it's cost effective, and cost effective has two components, right? Cost and effective. So it's a lot less costly to serve the same people with the same disabilities in their own homes with supportive services that are individually tailored to them, that come to them, than it is to serve them in congregate settings. Studies have shown that. Now, how much less costly depends on the kind of disability, it depends on the kind of settings, it depends on the kind of services. But depending on all those things, it can be up to a third as costly. It can be down to a third as costly to serve people in their own homes, and effective to serve them better, to provide services that actually enable people to live full and independent lives as a part of the community. And people see that they're paying a lot more to get less when people are in nursing homes, are in psychiatric hospitals, etc. And they're paying a lot less to get more when people get to live in their own apartments with services tailored to them. Right? So that, I think, has been very important. Another crucial takeaway from the litigation has been that the litigation and the settlements have focused on what kinds of supports do people with disabilities and particular kinds of disabilities need to live flourishing lives in the community. It's not about the litigation that you heard at the beginning from the 70s and 80s, where the focus was close the institutions. Then we won't worry about what happens. Well, we know what happened, which is most of the people who went from the big institutions that were operated by the public sector into nursing homes. And now we have this problem all over again that we're cleaning up. So the focus of the settlements in Olmstead we've seen have been on building up the service system in the community with people's own homes. And that's very important. Okay, so takeaways from the settlements and litigation we've seen. What are the big emerging issues? Well, let me mention two because the time is limited. One is, up until a couple of years ago, the focus in Olmstead litigation and Olmstead enforcement had been on questions of where people live, on the integration of housing, essentially, and the service systems that go with that. But it had been very much focused on where do you live. Now, Olmstead and the ADA are not limited to that, right? The integration mandate that's enforced by Olmstead says that when states administer services for people with disabilities, they have to do so in the most integrated setting appropriate to the individual with a disability. So that's any services that go to people with disabilities. One crucial area of services is the services that are devoted to how people with disabilities spend their days. This can be employment or non-employment related services. Eve talked about this, the Rhode Island case, the Rhode Island settlement, which Eve just negotiated and brought home about a month ago, is a very crucial marker that employment, segregated employment and segregated day programs, including sheltered workshops and other kinds of day programs in which people with disabilities all go together. They may live in the community and then they spend their entire day in non-productive, completely isolated places and tasks. And that's not acceptable, and that's something that the Department of Justice will go after. There are difficult questions about how to do that. This is the subject of litigation that's ongoing in the state of Oregon, but it's a very important area that's going to emerge, that is emerging. Another very important area is the interaction between Olmstead and the Medicaid program. Medicaid is the biggest financer of the kinds of services that many people with disabilities get that are related to their disabilities. It has historically been the biggest incentive toward institutionalization that states have, and incentive toward segregation that states have. This is because there's a tension. It's not a conflict, I would say it's a tension. There's a tension between the orientation of the Medicaid program and the requirements of the ADA. The ADA requires integration. The Medicaid program is built around 1965 era understandings of a disability service system, which are focused on institutionalization. So it has an institutional bias. It's very easy if you're a state to get institutional services paid for. Not so easy to get integrated in the community services paid for, although it's possible and has become increasingly possible. with changes that began to be made to the Medicaid Act in the 1980s, have continued through the 80s and 90s, including with several important provisions in the Affordable Care Act. One important area we're going to see is in this area of so-called long-term care, which the Affordable Care Act took a step forward in trying to resolve through the flawed and now abandoned Class Act program. There's now a commission that's going to look at how to deal with this. But you'll find that long-term care, which is basically what the euphemism we use for the services that we're all going to need when we grow old enough that we all have disabilities if we don't have them already, and need to have people helping us with various daily tasks. Right? So long-term care right now is financed through a system, A, of private insurance, which is going away because the insurance companies can't afford it anymore. They're raising premiums and they're cutting their lines. And B, through Medicaid, which is focused on basically nursing homes as the paradigm of care and the paradigm setting. And the same pressures toward people wanting to live independent lives, the same pressures of cost, are going to lead to a focus on integration in that area and type principles. So that's an important thing to watch. These are areas that are going to continue to evolve. This is, as I said, the absolute core of what the ADA and the disability rights movement is about, which is about enabling people with disabilities, a class that now includes many of us, will eventually include every one of us in this room, making sure that people with disabilities can live full, flourishing, and equal lives as full members of the community. And I'm really happy to have a chance to talk to you about that today.